Hey friends, in this video, I'm going to go through everything you need to know to color hair like this. And I know how hard coloring hair can be. When I first started, I was definitely lost and had no clue how to approach it at all. But I'm going to share with you all the things I've learned about it from these past 6 years, so hopefully you can learn how to do it with less trouble than I did. Specifically, I'll take you through my process and explain each step from the sketch to the final render. I'll also go through things such as how to understand hair structure, how to set up the lighting, how to pick colors, and how to do stylized shading. Finally, I'll give you some troubleshooting tips you can use when you get stuck, so make sure to watch till the end. By the way, if you're new here, I'm Ori, I'm an illustrator, and let's get started. So the first step in my process is to draw the rough sketch. The initial idea I had for the character was simply a student theme of some sort. Composition-wise, since this was going to be a demonstration for this hair tutorial, I made it a bust-up composition so there would be more focus on the hair and the face. Now, before we can even color the hair, we first need to understand its structure. Doing so will not only help us draw the hair better, but also let us put the shadows more accurately when coloring. The easiest way to do so is to first understand where the different sections of the hair grows from on the head. Personally, I tend to divide the head into roughly these sections, and I draw the hair while keeping them in mind. Because it's really easy to mess things up and start drawing the hair from random places on the head, a useful tip when drawing is to add 3D contours onto it. Doing so lets you quickly see whether the structure is off or not. Of course, this is stylized art, so you don't need to be absolutely accurate to reality, and sometimes it just looks better when you do ignore it. But if you're new to drawing hair, I recommend making sure your structure is generally accurate. You need to learn the rules first before you can break them. Now that we've got the sketch, it's time to figure out the lighting for the piece. I sometimes do this straight in color, but generally it's much easier to do in black and white, especially if you want to try out different lighting scenarios. This is because by doing it in black and white, you don't have to think about the colors and shading at the same time, so you can focus on finding the best lighting setup. For the beginners out there, color and light is basically connected, and when you're coloring anything that's three-dimensional, you also have to think about whether it's in light or shadow. For example, here we have a flat 2D circle. But the moment it turns three-dimensional into a sphere, light and shadow applies, and you have to figure out which part is in light and which part is in shadow when coloring it. This means that when you're coloring, you're actually doing shading at the same time too. And that's one of the reasons why coloring can be so challenging. But don't worry, the way to deal with any complex multi-step problem is to break it apart and tackle each step individually. Which is why I recommend turning everything into black and white, so you can just focus on the lighting without having to worry about the colors at the same time. There are 4 things you need to decide for the lighting: the number of light sources, their location, their strength, and afterwards, their color. For this piece, I went with just one main light source that's white and relatively strong, and then I tried out a few different locations to see which one will look nice. Regarding the strength of the light, you also want to consider whether it's direct or diffuse light. Direct light is like the lighting you see in sunlight or with a spotlight, and diffuse light is like the lighting you see on a cloudy day. So unlike direct light, it's soft and not as strong. For this illustration, I used direct lighting, but if it was instead lit by diffuse light coming from above, it might look like this. You might notice that this type of lighting is typically seen in more design-focused illustrations, such as VTuber models, standing poses in games, or character design sheets. One of the reasons why is because diffuse lighting is more neutral and doesn't get in the way of the design. But of course, some illustrations also use it, so it really depends on what you're going for with the piece. I ended up choosing the 3/4 lighting because I wanted to emphasize the form of the hair for the sake of this tutorial. But I also felt it suited the story of the piece better, which I imagined to be something like this. By the way, if you're enjoying this tutorial so far, do subscribe so you don't miss out when I make a new one. With the lighting decided, it's time to add the colors. This creates the color rough, which is essentially a preview for what the final version will look like. After adding the colors in, I felt that the piece was a bit too boring and I didn't really feel motivated to paint it at all. So I decided that I had to make it more interesting by adding a bunch of things I like. The first thing I did was to change the uniform up a bit, so she's now wearing a cardigan, and just use colors I like as opposed to sticking to the traditional uniform colors. I also felt that having student be the only theme was a bit plain, so I decided to also add the cat attribute to her. When it comes to picking color, you want to choose colors based on the mood or feeling you want the piece to have. One way to do that is to break them up into 3 categories. Primary, the colors of the piece that take up the most area. Secondary, the colors that take up the second most area. And finally, accents, colors that take up a small area. For this piece, this combination of light and pale colors give the character a cute and soft impression, which is what I was going for. One method I found useful for learning how to pick colors and color schemes is to study the colors used in art I like by creating a color bar. So if you were to study this illustration, for example, you'd make a color bar that shows all the colors used and how it's distributed like this. With the color off done, next I lowered the transparency and drew the line art on top. Then I separated out the different parts and basically copy and pasted in all the colors from the color off. This forms the base for my final render, and it's now time to do the coloring and shading. But before we get to that, I'm very excited to say that Clip Studio Paint is kindly sponsoring this video. I've been using it to draw for the past 6 years now, including for this illustration, so I was thrilled when they reached out. If you haven't heard of them before, Clip Studio Paint is a drawing app for creating illustrations, manga, and animations. Out of all the drawing apps I've tried so far, it's by far my favorite. One of the features I love is the time-lapse function, which just makes it so easy to record my drawing process and export it as a clip. And the feature I found that just makes it so unique is its robust asset store, where you can pretty much find any brush, material, or 3D reference you'd ever need for drawing. But the default brushes are also great, and I regularly use things such as the G-Pen and the soft brush. Their watercolor brush settings are also nice for spreading colors. So if you're interested in trying it out, Clip Studio Paint is available on all devices and has a generous 3-month free trial, so do check them out through the link in the description. Now it's time to start coloring the hair. I use the 1-2-3 shading system, which is a system you can use to achieve the kind of stylistic coloring and shading that you often see in anime style art. In Japanese, this is referred to as the Ichikage, Nikage, and Sankage. When it comes to layer structure, for this piece I kept it simple. I just had the base color layer and created new normal layers on top that are clipped to it. And if you're using Clip Studio, you can simply press this button to clip layers. With the 1-2-3 shadow system, you essentially start with the lightest shadow, the first shadow, and then get progressively darker, with the third shadow being the darkest. Here's how I approach each one and what they represent. The first shadow separates what's in light and what's in dark and captures the overall form. Essentially, if you have a ball, every part of the ball which is in shadow would be the first shadow. Here, my base color is already the color of the first shadow, so instead I added the light in. But you can of course start with the opposite and have the base color be the light and then add the first shadow in like this. This is purely up to preference and it doesn't really matter which way you do it. Then I added in a darker second shadow for the cast shadows. The cast shadow is what appears when an object blocks the light, like the shadow the ball is casting on the floor here. In the case of this illustration, it's things like this tied up hair blocking the light and the raised up hair casting a shadow here. Then I add in the dark third shadow for the occlusion shadows. This is the really dark shadow that appears when things are touching, and it's hard for light to get in there, like here where this ball is touching the floor. Then I added in some 1.5 shadows, mainly to show the darker shadows within the shadows. It's 1.5 because it's between the first and second shadows in terms of how dark it is. You can think of this as the core shadow, like the dark shadows you see here on the ball. But I also used it to add in details, such as to indicate the sheen of the hair, since hair is reflective. And also to make some adjustments to the other shadows, as you can see here. So I mentioned that you go darker as you progress from the first to the third shadows, but that doesn't mean just dropping the color closer to black. The general method I use is to not only go darker, which is down, but also cooler, which is shifting the hue towards blue, and more saturated, which is to the right. There are of course times this principle doesn't apply, but generally it's handy to remember. Note that you want to make sure that you have enough contrast between the light and shadows as a whole, meaning there's enough difference between them in terms of how dark and light they are. But you don't need to get the colors right in one go, and you can always make adjustments as you go along, which you'll see me do later. Once the shadows are in, it's time to add in the reflected light. Basically, this is the light that reflects off something else onto the object, such as the light which hits the floor and reflects onto the ball here. In an illustration, we're kind of free to just make it up and do whatever will look the best. Note though that it won't be as bright as the main light source, as light weakens as it reflects. As for the highlights, here the lights are already really strong, so it's already serving as my highlight. But if you have more of a diffuse light setup, you could add highlights like this to the hair. This is probably the most common type of hair highlight you see in anime art. And you can even play around with the colors. Some people even make it rainbow colored like this. So it really depends on the lighting setup and the kind of stylization you're going for. Finally, I like to add some warm tones to the area of the hair that touches the face. This is essentially some of the skin color underneath showing through, which adds a feeling of translucency to the hair. With the basic rendering done, I then add a tone curve layer to bump up the contrast by making the shadows a bit darker. With the tone curve layer, you can essentially adjust how dark or light certain colors are. Bringing a dot up will make it lighter, and bringing it down will make it darker. The tone curve will always differ from piece to piece, so the best way to learn how to use it is to just play around with it. A little goes a long way with tone curve adjustments, and it can quickly mess with the color and make things too saturated, so be careful to not overdo it. For this piece, I only use tone curve layers for the adjustments, but other correction layers I often use are the color balance and HSV layers. These also let you adjust the colors of the piece, and again, the best way to learn how to use them is to just play around and experiment with them. Then I added in some more details, mainly in the transition areas between the light and shadows. This helps to smooth the transition a bit, so the jump from light to dark isn't so sudden, and it also shows the form of the hair more. Then on a new normal layer above the line art, I added some loose hair strands and some minor adjustments. Then I added in some warm colors to the transition areas between the light and shadows. Essentially, it's replicating the colored contour effect you normally see as light transitions into shadow if the light source is colored. And because sunlight and many other light sources are warm, it usually feels natural to add these in as a warm color. Then I also added in some of these pink accent highlights on the hair as a finishing touch. Finally, I added in one more tone curve layer to increase the overall contrast of the piece by making all the shadows a bit darker. And with that, the hair coloring is complete. A helpful tip when coloring is to turn the piece into black and white from time to time to make sure that it makes sense and looks good without color too. Because in many cases, if it doesn't work in black and white, it won't work in color either. Turning it into black and white also makes it easier to see whether there's enough contrast between the lights and darks, and if you should adjust the colors. Every app has its own way to do this, but in Clip Studio, the way to turn things into black and white is by simply creating a new white fill layer and setting the layer mode to color. If you get stuck and don't know how to put the shadows in on something, it usually means you don't understand the 3D structure of the object well enough. So one solution is to find reference and analyze it. For the hair, this can mean finding real-life photos or an example of how an artist you look up to rendered a similar hairstyle. Then you analyze it by drawing 3D contours on top, just like the tip earlier on hair structure. I also recommend drawing 3D contours on top of what you drew to check that the structure still makes sense. Taking time to find and analyze reference like this when you're stuck is much better than trying to randomly figure the shape out and will save you a lot of headache. But sometimes the solution is simply more practice and repetition. Because everything is learnable, but it does take time and effort. But if you do put in the time and effort, you'll eventually get the hang of it. Anyway, if you're still watching, thanks for getting all the way to the end. And I've actually made in-depth tutorials on how to draw the hair, how to draw the head, and the 1, 2, 3 shadow system. So make sure to check them out through this handy playlist I've put together on the left. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss out on any new ones. This was Ori, and I hope you have a great rest of the day. Bye!